This is episode 99 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we'll be discussing sovereignty and Indigenous nations. If you enjoyed today's show, please remember to donate on patreon.com/AskHistorians. As a special note, Brian Watson will be back in 2 weeks with an extra special 100th episode of the Ask Historians podcast, so please be sure to check in then. With that said, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Andres Pertiera, and today we'll be talking with Snapshot52, aka Kyle Pittman. He is an Ask Historians mod and also a mod over on Our Indian Country, and today we're going to be talking about Native Nations and United States policy. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Andreas.
Great to have you back. I think, what is this, your third time with us?
Yes.
Great. So today we're going to be switching up the format a little bit. Instead of a series of the guest responding to a series of smaller questions, we're going to have Kyle kind of explain a topic for 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to jump into a kind of discussion of the main key brought up. So with that, Kyle, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. So the topic for today's discussion involves a particular aspect of American Indians that is both relevant in history and even now in our day. This aspect concerns sovereignty. Now, this aspect is unique to the native nations that reside within the borders of the United States, for it sets them apart from any other group and puts them on par with the federal government of the United States. Yet, this notion of sovereignty, typically referred to as tribal sovereignty, is often criticized by a variety of people, from the general public to academics to lawmakers. Some of the criticisms involve a diminishing of the sovereign status of tribes through word or deed. The claim that tribes lost the war and thus have no right to preside in a sovereign matter. Tribes were never organized to the point of maintaining a supposed true sovereign status. These criticisms and others are largely prevalent when the topic of tribal sovereignty arises in modern discourse. But are the aforementioned criticisms valid? In my opinion, they hardly are. The tribal sovereignty is something that not only played a role in the shaping of American politics of the past with regards to what we consider foreign and domestic policy, but also the conduct of the interior departments of government, both local and national, in the United States today. Before we get into the more contemporary items, let's first consider the state of these native nations prior to contact with Europeans and mass colonization. The first question that's often raised is, did Native Americans understand what sovereignty was, and did they exercise it? Sovereignty was definitely part of many indigenous peoples' political thoughts. The key to understanding this is realizing that what we might interpret as politics or sovereignty could be vastly different from what was and is considered politics and sovereignty in indigenous communities. The whole philosophical basis is entirely different, and it can differ from tribe to tribe. So to really get into a discussion about this, we need to define sovereignty and decide if we're using a definition from an indigenous viewpoint or a Western viewpoint, the two definitions that usually come into conflict. In many Western traditions, sovereignty is designated through politics and/or military power. However, traditional views for some tribes could base sovereignty through such things as sovereignty, culture, or even language. For example, Vine Deloria Jr., a prominent Native American scholar and author, commented on sovereignty by saying, "Sovereignty in the final instance can be said to consist more of continued cultural integrity than of political powers. Sovereignty then revolves about the manner in which traditions are developed, sustained, and transformed to confront new conditions. It involves most of all a strong sense of community, discipline, and a degree of self-containment and pride that transcends all objective codes, rules, and regulations." Tribes operated and maintained their own nations according to their standards, much like any country did. What we often fail to realize, however, when we compare nations of similar time periods, is that the indigenous world was quite different from the world that was experiencing such things as the Renaissance or industrialization. If we think about it, how native nations in the Americas operated prior to colonization, in a sense, were how all nations originally operated. For if we go back far enough, we all come from indigenous peoples at some point. Let's consider one brief example. On the east coast of the United States, the Haudenosaunee, commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, operated a complex government structure with a functioning constitution known as the Great Law of Peace, and an alliance between several nations. This Great Law of Peace came from one of the more renowned political philosophers of American Indian political thought. He was known as the Peacemaker. The Constitution that the Iroquois established was based on this Great Law of Peace, and it even inspired elements of the United States Constitution. One of the defining elements of this law is that it was established upon the basis of peace rather than law and order. Peace was therefore defined as not the absence of war and strife, but as an active process where humans strived for universal justice. This process then produced peace for society as a whole. One thing people often look toward to identify aspects of sovereignty often concern land. In the Western tradition, this involves the designating of property. The Haudenosaunee designated the lands within their boundaries according to the traditional homelands of the tribes that comprised the alliance, but noted that these boundaries existed because of linguistic differences, not a separation of national boundaries via politics. To accomplish this, it was recognized that each of the comprising tribes had to relinquish some of their existing sovereignty to the other nations of the Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee operated under principles of direct democracy. The leaders, or chiefs, were seen as servants of the people, and everyone was allowed the ability for direct participation in the workings of the government. Supposed power and authority were explicitly seen as lying with the people and only transmitted through the leaders. Based on what we've described here, this sounds like a fully functioning, well-established, and certainly recognized nation to me. And this is just a brief summary, mind you, of one nation who happened to be comprised of several other nations, of the thousands that existed in the Americas. In a recent answer I gave on the sub, I provided another key example of a description of native nation acting as a sovereign just after contact. The following is an excerpt from that answer. In Paper Sovereigns, Anglo-Native Treaties and the Law of Nations, 1604 to 1664, Geoffrey Glover, the author of this book, investigates the treaty-making process between English colonists and native nations in the early 17th century. He reviews collections of English notes, transcripts, and records, as well as recorded native oral accounts to paint a better understanding of the native positions with regards to treaties, a formal recognition of another nation's sovereignty. In the beginning of the book, he examines the writings of Gabriel Archer, who was the official recorder of the Virginia colony and who documented many of the encounters of the Jamestown colonists with natives, particularly of the Powhatans. What is key to keep in mind is that for us to understand how natives viewed themselves, we must interpret things through an indigenous lens, which is what Glover tries to develop by contrasting how things were recorded with traditional European methods of establishing treaties. Therefore, he says, quote, Archer's letter did not resemble what most Europeans would have recognized as a legal document of any kind, much less a land claim. There were none of the Latin formulas so familiar in European treaties, no lists of witnesses, no signatures, not even the X marks found in treaties between the English crowned and illiterate Irish clansmen. In a startling departure from European conventions, Archer offered an account of treaty-making on Indian terms, pointing to the exchange of shouts and other indigenous rituals as proof of friendship between Newport and the king. Early Anglo-Native treaty documents were never simply rote accounts of political transactions set down according to some pre-existing formula. They were rhetorical documents, crafted to meet the needs of particular constituencies, English and Native, and bundled with claims about land, sovereignty, and trade. End quote. While it is true that natives could not write in the languages of the Europeans, the languages that most written documents would have been transcribed into, native nations were not completely ignorant of the treaty-making process. They had their own set of treaty-making processes, and they were also learning that of the European nations who were now coming to the Americas. The records of English interactions with natives demonstrate that in order to survive, the early colonists insisted on following native customs with regards to politics due to the simple fact that they couldn't afford not to. They were outnumbered and at times relied heavily on the native population to sustain them. Additionally, natives caught on fast as to how the Europeans did treaties, and while they often did suffer due to the written word, they were not absolutely helpless or ignorant. What this means is that from either an indigenous or European perspective, it was noted that Native Americans were operating with their own geopolitical sphere of influence, with their own complex systems of governance and territory, which strengthens the claim that they recognize their own right to their territory, their own laws, and their own distinct culture, which constitute the elements of sovereignty. Glover further depicts this by commenting again on the writings of Archer. He says, quote, Archer depicts the New World as a political order of monarchies, much like Europe, and in many ways his relation resembles European diplomatic writings. Archer describes how the English make treaties with the peoples they encountered, entering into alliances with sovereign kings. End quote. In Archer's account, Archer records various meetings with natives of a 1602 voyage with a captain named Newport. These meetings, which are categorized by date, progressively paint a picture of native sovereignty that is expressed through their political structure and displays of authority in the eyes of their cultures. After departing from Jamestown, the Newport expedition ran across the first great Indian kingdom, referred to as Wyandotte by Archer. During this meeting, one of the most powerful kings of the Indian nations along the Atlantic coast, they encountered him, and this was Powhatan. In these meetings, salutes, shouting, and rising were exchanged, showing the superior authority of this newly arrived Indian king. However, Glover notes something very interesting. Quote, Indeed, far from accepting English power, the king issues a mandate commanding the English to travel no farther. Intimidated, Newport backs down. The Indian king recognizes no subordination. He views any friendship as implying English subjection to him, or at the very least, an unsteady equality. End quote. What we see here is an assertion of native independence from the encroaching European colonists. Through even European documents, which recounted many early interactions with tribes, we are given a picture that elevates the political status of Indian nations to rival that of European monarchs and empires. Further cementing of this status was evident in later periods as well. In 1763, the British issued a royal proclamation that decreed settlers should abstain from settling beyond the Appalachia to preserve the territory belonging to Indian nations that assisted the British against the French, which I'll speak about a little more later. Definitively, Native Americans throughout interactions with Europeans and Americans considered themselves sovereign, by their own standards, but also by the standards of Europeans. Over time, those standards would change, particularly on the western side of things, and the political status of Indian nations would, and still does, swing like a pendulum, going from a more or less complete ranking of sovereigns to a diluted classification of domestic dependent nations. Regardless of outside considerations, though, sovereignty has been and always will be part of Native American political thought. So as just mentioned, another example of this demonstration of native status in the eyes of Europeans was that royal proclamation. European nations recognized native nations and their sovereignty in this proclamation of 1763. The defeat of the French in the French and Indian War had significantly changed Euro-Indian relationships. With the French gone, tribes only had to deal with the English colonial power. The important political relationships after the conclusion of this conflict became those with the king. The king recognized that much of this victory occurred because of the native allies of the English, and that internal conflicts with native nations would be quelled if land disputes, particularly over hunting grounds, would be resolved, and that if tribes were dealt with in an appropriate manner. Thus, in 1763, this royal proclamation was issued by the king that made the crest of the Appalachian Mountains a formal boundary beyond which settlement was prohibited. This imperial boundary was not something a colony could change at will and was very important for tribes. It essentially became the legal reality due to the recognition of the boundary by the crown. And this recognition imparted to the tribes who also listened to this boundary, who agreed to this boundary, it imparted to them the same status as it would for any other nation that this boundary could have been established with. It was a status and a recognition of sovereignty. But this is all good for European nations. What about the United States? By the time of the establishment of the United States, we see a subtle but general at the same time shift in how tribes were dealt with. The first thing to be aware of is that tribes were still very strong at this point, despite all the notions of disease wiping them out. The United States could not afford to get into costly wars with tribes where they stood a real possibility of losing. The very first treaty that the United States made was actually with an Indian tribe, the Delaware tribe, in 1778. Which proved vital for the American war efforts because it allowed them to advance through Delaware-held territory. Yet, at the end of the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris did not necessarily work for tribes in their future relations with the U.S. The British sought to establish an Indian territory that the U.S. would recognize to prevent further expansion, but this plan had failed in negotiations. In an excerpt, or I would like to read an excerpt from American Indians, American Justice by Vine Deloria Jr. Regarding this, and where it says, regarding American treaties with tribes. The American peace treaties with the tribes on the western frontier required by the Peace of Paris reflected both the relative military strength of the tribe and its previous relationships with the colonies. Apart from the usual provisions for the making of peace and returning of hostages taken in the late war, these treaties had some interesting jurisdictional provisions for the resolution of conflicts on the frontier. Although the treaties acknowledged the sovereignty of the United States in formal language in their preambles, it was evident in their remaining articles that former British provisions for handling criminal activity and preventing conflicts were simply being transposed into this new situation. The treaty with the Cherokees, for example, signed in 1785 at Hopewell, provided that if any citizen of the United States or other person, presumably an immigrant who moved to the frontier while not formally recognized as an American citizen, who attempted to settle on any of the Cherokee lands, did not remove from his settlement within 6 months of the ratification of the treaty, such person shall forfeit the protection of the United States, and the Indians may punish him or not as they please. What this demonstrates is that even though the United States was essentially taking the place of the European nations, the United States was agreeing to uphold and to continue upholding the same standard that the European nations had been delegating to tribes. In 1787, the United States established the Northwest Ordinance for the interior of the North American continent. This was an act of Congress that was later reaffirmed in 1789 after the U.S. Constitution was formalized. Without getting into too many details, this ordinance primarily dealt with land holdings and the admission of new states into the Union. For tribes, this legislation revealed how the United States was attempting to frame them within their internal politics. Article 3 of this ordinance says, "Religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in their property, rights, and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them, and for preserving peace and friendship with them." End quote. This essentially recognized the landholdings of tribes, meaning their position was not seen with a view to conquest or lack of sovereignty. Quite the opposite, really. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795, a treaty involving the Miami Confederacy, was the conclusion of a fierce war with the United States. This treaty designated the territory of the tribes involved as their country. In 1790, the United States passed the first Trade and Intercourse Act. This act, which regulated trade between Americans and Indians, contained the words Indian country, though this was more of a generalized term. Part of it regulated crimes against Indians by non-Indians and indicated that if a non-Indian was convicted, they were to be punished the same as if they had inflicted a crime upon another non-Indian. So what we're seeing here is that in the early United States policy with regards to Indian nations, they were very much treated like as if they were foreign nations. They were seen as having full sovereignty. They were not seen as being regulated by the United States, but rather their relationships from the United States end is what was regulated. That tribes could not be touched because they themselves maintained the same status as any other country would have, whether that was Britain, France, Russia, China, any other country. Now, later on into the 1800s, we see the Lewis and Clark expedition. This expedition, in reality, was a military expedition. And their job, as they were going through the interior of the United States in the newly purchased Louisiana Purchase, their job was to go to the tribes in this area and to establish diplomatic relationships with them. Because the United States recognized that even the tribes they did not have contact with, if there were tribes to make more contact with, had that same level of sovereignty as the tribes on the East Coast did. However, things start to change at around this point as well. In 1823, we have the first case of what is known as the Marshall Trilogy. This was a series of Supreme Court cases in where the United States essentially developed their federal Indian policy to a greater degree, and that still has influence down to today. So in 1823, we have the very first case, which was titled Johnson versus McIntosh. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that although Indians were the rightful occupants of the land, tribes had no power to sell lands to anyone without the approval of the federal government, as clearly stated in the 1790 Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. The ruling claimed that because the federal government held title to all Indian lands, which Europeans had discovered, the right of Indians to complete sovereignty over their land was limited. And now we see one of the very first cases in where the doctrine of discovery is something that was implemented into U.S. policy. That even though the United States was someone who came after the major colonization, they inherited, along, just as we had discussed previously, the same regulations the British had delegated to the tribes, they inherited the same doctrines, the same mentality, and the same motivations that these European nations had. And in their mind, they inherited the same land claims that the British had laid to North America. So based on this, in this Supreme Court case, where two individuals were essentially debating over a land claim, they established that the United States inherited such land claims from the British and that the Indian title was relinquished, or in some cases held in trust by the United States. But now, in 1831, we see another shift in this policy. In 1831, the next Supreme Court case of the Marshall Trilogy is Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that Indians were neither citizens of the United States nor foreign nations. Instead, they were domestic dependent nations whose relationship to the U.S. resembles that of a ward to his guardian. This ruling set a legal precedent for the trust relationship in which the U.S. has a duty to provide certain benefits and services for the Indian tribes and people. So the whole reason this court case came about was because Georgia was essentially trying to impose their state laws on the Cherokee Nation, which resided within the borders of Georgia. However, Cherokee Nation rejected that assertion of those laws, and thus tried to bring this case in litigation to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ultimately threw the case out, claiming that the Cherokee Nation had no ability to do so, for they were not U.S. citizens. And yet, even though they were not foreign nations, and they were being called domestic dependent nations, the Supreme Court had no jurisdiction to rule in this case. Then, a year later in 1832, we have Worcester v. Georgia. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that the state had no authority, the state being Georgia, over persons and actions within the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation, and that state laws did not extend to Indian country. The ruling clarified that Indian tribes were under the protection of the federal government and that Congress, and not the states, had plenary or overriding power regarding Indian tribes. So we see that even within these three court cases, that pendulum, as I mentioned earlier, is what's really taking effect here. We go from one position into where the tribes have lost their title to their land, and that because they were quote-unquote discovered, they could not possess said land. So how could they be seen as a sovereign nation? Yet in 1831, we see that switch into the sense that they are given that, quote-unquote given, that status of sovereignty back in the eyes of the United States, where they're domestic dependent nations, but they're to be handled now as a domestic issue rather than a foreign issue, which, as we've previously discussed, they were always treated in a foreign-like manner. Then a year later, 1832, we have it switch again, which almost seems like a reinforcement of full sovereignty that the U.S. says the tribes have, because state law could not extend into a reservation boundary or the Cherokee Nation. And this really confuses things because now the case is essentially putting the tribe on the same level as the federal government, for that's who has to deal with tribes. States cannot do so. Yet the legal precedent shows that tribes somehow had lost sovereignty. So we really see a dynamic, evolving policy when it comes to how tribes are going to be treated and how the U.S. thinks they should be treated. But this all completely changed when we get later into the 1800s. It was about the 1850s that the reservation system was created, in where tribes who had ceded their lands through treaty or who had lost them through conquest were now confided to these tracts of lands that were often established by treaties themselves. Now, on these reservations, they were deemed to have full sovereignty. They were deemed to have their own laws, their own way of doing things, and yet the United States imposed their own systems on these reservations, such as installing an Indian agent who would act as the liaison from the tribes to the federal government. But these Indian agents, who also had a police force, often regulated the reservations according to their own will. Then in 1871, we see the end of the treaty-making process, where Congress formally declares that they will no longer make tribes with Indian nations, but all previous treaties that had not been abrogated were to be upheld, hence why treaties today still matter. Yet even though that was the case, we still see that the U.S. progressively was implementing their own laws, their own legislation that would affect Indian tribes, and that essentially was undermining the supposed sovereignty that they had. For example, in 1881, there was a court case that actually was brought to the Supreme Court again. An Indian man on the Lakota reservation, who was known as Crow Dog, had shot and killed another Indian named Spotted Tail, who was a Lakota chief. In this time, the United States wanted to charge Crow Dog with murder. However, no legislation had been formally enacted to allow this to happen. So, the Lakota Council actually charged Crow Dog under their own system of how they did things, and they dealt with him according to their tradition. Crow Dog was to pay restitution to the dead man's family. However, the U.S. authorities then prosecuted Crow Dog anyway for murder in a federal court, even though they had no jurisdiction. The Supreme Court reaffirmed that unless Congress authorized it, federal courts had no jurisdiction. Therefore, in 1885, Congress passed the Major Crimes Act, which allowed for 7 major crimes to be handled by the federal government, therefore allowing such things as murder to be tried in federal courts. This in itself was a limitation placed on sovereignty by tribes, or placed on a limitation on tribes for their sovereignty. We also see the further development of this in 1887 with the passing of the General Allotment Act, which we've spoken about in other podcasts, where this act essentially took all of the land that was designated as surplus land in a reservation, opened it up for settlement, and allotted 160-acre plots to each individual Indian. And then in 25 years, after it was put into a trust status, after 25 years it would fall out of trust status, turn into fee simple land, and the state would then take full jurisdiction over that land. So as we see here, we see just a gradual diminishing of what's considered sovereignty, where the tribes go from being considered essentially a foreign nation, and then as it progressively goes down, they're now a domestic case, to now where they're United States citizens, to where this sovereignty doesn't necessarily matter in the eyes of the law.
These are really interesting points, and one of the things that really draws my attention is the discussion around sovereignty is a complex one, because the nationhood, sovereignty are also concepts that are evolving in Europe at the time. My understanding is that the beginning of a full state system, the codification of sovereignty, really begins in the 17th century with the Treaty of Westphalia and the like. Have you read Locke's treatises on government, out of curiosity?
I've read portions of it as pertains to my area of study, but I've not gone out of my way to read like the whole thing, of course.
Yeah, the most scholars also tend to avoid the first one, which is just a long diatribe justifying divine monarchy. But yeah, so but in terms of what we're talking about today, from what I recall, Locke basically in this before racism had really evolved is into the full-blown pseudoscience it would become in the 19th century. In the 17th century, Locke would try to justify the idea that indigenous peoples basically had not only ignoring their sovereignty, but basically had no right to land because they weren't taking, I think, full advantage of it, was his argument. How do you see the logic of abrogating the sovereignty of these indigenous tribes from Locke, which is just they're not taking quote unquote or not quote unquote, but basically full advantage of the lands and their resources, to the Marshall Trilogy and later ideas which seem to be more rooted in racist ideas of inferiority and the incapacity to necessarily make those decisions?
Well, I mean, if you were to ask me, there really is no logic behind it. I mean, what we're having here is a conflict of worlds, and where it's pretty clear that they have different ways of doing things, different systems, different institutions, completely different cultures, and yet it's the refusal to acknowledge one as the interests of the other slowly become more dominant and more aggressive. You go from this idea where, which I have read about Locke, proposing that tribes essentially don't have a right to the land because they're not using it. We see that in the development of arguments even today. A lot of the times when a treaty comes up to prevent some kind of act of the state, or maybe of that the public desires, one of the first arguments I often hear is that people say, well, the tribes aren't using their land, why should they have a right to it? And the reality is that it's not being used to how they see it. It's not being used for their standards. It's a very capitalistic notion that a land has to be used, has to be developed, has to be used in some kind of expropriative manner, so that way you can benefit for yourself. Whereas tribes recognize that even the land itself has a certain amount of rights, that the land itself does not need to be abused for its providing for you. So this idea that tribes would somehow lose their sovereignty and lose their land, I would say, because they're not using it, I would say is a result of that type of mentality. That as the U.S. decided to further expand and further grow, that they saw all of this land that they, through legislation and through tradition, had locked in for the tribes according to their standard. Then they realized, oh, well, maybe we didn't want to do that. And rather than going through the formal process of trying to alleviate their own issues, they decided, whether that be through conquest or through imposition of their rule, that's how they were going to do it. And really, that lends itself to the idea that the U.S. wanted to live in isolation, which it did for a long time. By doing so and closing out all these other European nations, it prevented the tribal nations from being able to establish better relationships with those nations to bring in further help if they ever were to go to major war with the United States. But the United States defended all of those outside boundaries, kept the issue internal, and then that's how they were able to further impose their imperialistic tendencies. And then when it comes to how they decided themselves, I mean, really, it was all an internal justification. We see that similar to when the conquistadors were coming to the Americas, and you had De las Casas, who was trying to, argue in a sense for the humanity of the Indians and for their right to be there. And yet, of course, as we know, the Spanish didn't necessarily listen to that.
Regarding your point on Las Casas, so my understanding is that Las Casas did want to improve the conditions of indigenous peoples, but it wasn't necessarily that he was respecting their sovereignty or their independence. It was more of a justification for improving their conditions under Spanish rule. Would that be correct or appropriate?
Yes, that would be correct. And when it came to that justification, it was an internal deal. Even though he himself was not recognizing the sovereignty of these native nations and trying to provide a basis for that within the Spanish legal system, he was working under the Spanish legal system, trying to provide a moral justification to improve the conditions for those natives. And so when we think about that, and apply that same kind of mentality to the United States, to the indigenous nations within those borders of the United States, they did not care whether it was a political thought or a philosophical thought from Locke or what John Marshall's ideas were, but to the United States, to their tradition, to their desires, they wanted to establish this justification. And so it's important to remember that this pendulum, as it was brought up earlier, how it swings back and forth, really it was arbitrary. How the United States felt at one point, it was different at how they felt at another point, and all along the way they were trying to justify their decisions regarding these matters.
That reminds me. I think I brought this same author up last time we talked about Aimé César's idea in Discourse on Colonialism, how racism as an ideology and other, which, it had predecessors as well in the 16th and 17th centuries, was just the ideological justification of the colonial system, but that the prime mover is the colonial system and the desire to obtain more lands, more ownership of the labor of the indigenous populations, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Very, very true. And in the United States in particular, that those desires manifested themselves in the ideology of manifest destiny, where the American citizens, the American populace, they were determined. They felt it was their God-given duty, divinely inspired, to expand across the United States, to take over more, and to have it for the benefit of their families and also of their nation. And really, it's this kind of mentality, this kind of belief that was really fostering and embedded itself into American society in the 1800s when it was really coming to birth, and what no doubt would have had an influence on individuals such as Marshall himself. And really, that colonial interpretation of it was meant to dismay the fact that the tribes were considered sovereign. This diminishing of their sovereignty helped the Americans decide for themselves that what they were doing was right, and that this expansion was correct, and that the tribes themselves had no right to the land for whatever reason, whether it because they were Christian or they were unchristian, they were pagan, whether it be that they were savages, whether that be that they were inferior. Really, colonialism doesn't necessarily have a primary mode of transportation. It will look for any mode of transportation to fulfill the desires of those who are exercising those colonialistic conducts.
Right. So, from a methodological point of view, the prime focus it may be interesting to try and understand these justifications and how they evolve, but the prime focus should be on the objective and the methods used to abrogate the sovereignty, and the rest is just kind of justifications of the same, right?
Yeah, correct. I mean, there's a place to speak for what those justifications are and why they came about that way, because for American Indians, how those justifications occurred can also be a point of argument. For example, the deal with the Northwest Ordinance, which was established and had language interpreting that tribes themselves were to be treated right and appropriate and justly, and that in itself has been used as arguments for legal precedent. But ultimately, it should be the methods that are focused on and how those and the results of those methods are dealt with, as opposed to what the exact motivations and justifications were, because those have changed consistently throughout time, whether that be from European nations to the birth of the United States to where we are now.
Right. And was there kind of any sort of a precedent for this transformation of these sovereign nations, the sovereign indigenous nations, into quote unquote dependent nations? Was this just kind of a category that was just invented specifically for this purpose, or would you say that this is something that had roots, for example, elsewhere?
Well, as mentioned at the outset, speaking here, is that tribes are in a unique position with regards to any other group in the United States today. And a lot of it extends from that federal Indian policy there at the very beginning. Would there be precedent? I would say yes, because the United States, coming from colonial people themselves, the British Empire, they were already expanding in other places. Colonialism by this time wasn't a newfound deal per se, perhaps on the scale that it was, but in general, colonialism had already been occurring. And so, how these indigenous nations were being dealt with was how the European nations and how America later decided was appropriate for their own interests. Really, the main backing behind colonial oppression is military force. Today, the only thing that keeps tribes subjugated is the fact that they don't have militaries and that the United States does. So, this whole idea that tribes are somehow less is simply for the fact that the tribes had something and even still have something that the United States wanted from them. And so, why tribes were seen as having this sovereign status is, again, it's also that matter of our, subjectivity, how they felt at that time, all the little nuances that played in that way to where we are today, where tribes are subjugated, and then the United States benefits from the resources that they extract from those tribes and have extracted from the tribes.
What about sovereignty in the 17th and 18th centuries? Was it based on nations, or was it based on the sovereign and his personal possessions in Europe? Because like my idea is just that was it a question what was being recognized in the case by the 17th century and 18th century European powers? Was it nations in terms of like 19th century nationalism, or was it specific sovereigns? Or
well, I mean, I don't feel per se qualified to speak about what the Europeans themselves viewed as what qualified their sovereignty. But what I can say that I think gives a reflection on that is what they looked for with regards to the tribes. And typically with the tribes, they looked for that solid land claim, the boundaries. They looked for property ownership. They looked for a centralized, in a sense, or at least a recognizable form of government. But as we read there in Glover's account in Paper Sovereigns, that the European colonists who arrive were acknowledged that the tribes did not conduct things according to the European tradition and went along with how the natives how they did things in their world. And again, a lot of that can be attested to the fact that the European nations couldn't afford not to do that. The Jamestown colony was suffering, and so to turn away the only people who were in that new world for them that could possibly offer any assistance would have been foolish for them to do. So they had no choice but to play by the natives' rules or die. But as European influence and power started expanding and encroaching more, they started implementing those things that they were looking for. And even with regards to the United States, it was very much that same case. If they wanted to recognize the tribes as sovereign, they wanted to see in them what they considered sovereignty. And that's why in 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, they provided a form of government like a template form of government for tribes to use if they accepted this new legislation Congress was passing. And this template was structured in a way that the U.S. found appropriate, that they said that this is how we want to talk to the tribes, and that if the tribes want to talk to us, how they have to talk to us. And that is how they were qualifying, in a sense, the tribe to be a government, and inherent with that government would be their idea of sovereignty.
Okay. So I think you're going to talk about also the self-determination era, correct?
Yes. So as we've seen this development all throughout the last few hundred years of how the United States has decided to treat Indian tribes, this drastically changes once again when we get into the 20th century. By 1924, American Indians were quote-unquote granted United States citizenship to the entire population who had not yet obtained it. In 1934, you have the passing of the Indian Reorganization Act. And then in the 1950s, you have the termination era, which we've spoken about previously before in one of the other episodes, where the United States essentially decided to end their relationship, their political relationship with tribes, and to cut off what they were considering the trust responsibility. Reservations would be dissolved, the assets of the tribes would be liquidated, and that the federal services would stop. And this was done in an attempt to save money, supposedly, even though it ended up costing the U.S. government much more money to try and terminate these tribes. So after this terrible, absolutely worst policy was passed, and it went through the ringer, so to speak, it was repealed. And part of that repealing occurred in the 1970s when the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed in 1975. And it was from this point that the United States realized that tribes were competent and that they could handle their own affairs. So they passed this act, and one of the primary things it allowed to do was it allowed tribes to take control from federal entities over programs and services that were offered on the reservations. And in doing so, this demonstrated that the tribes could govern themselves, and that it asserted that sovereign status that they possess. That's kind of where we are now. We're still in that self-determination era, where the United States, in some respects, still acts paternalistically over tribes, thinking that they are incompetent and unable to handle certain portions of governing themselves. Yet, we also see that more and more services, more and more programs, more and more jurisdiction is being handed back over to the tribes. And that's because the U.S. is recognizing that, okay, we've have precedent that they have sovereignty, that they're established to have sovereignty, and yet we haven't been acting this way. Now they're litigating against us. And what do we do about that now? And then we go back to this whole internal justification, this internal struggle in American politics about how they think things should be handled. And, in reality, the tribes over here are still trying to do their best to deal with the colonial cocktail that they were dealt all throughout history, and then at the same time reassert that sovereignty. So today, that's what tribes try to do. They assert that sovereignty through the treaties that have been established. They assert that sovereignty through the legislation that's been enacted. And they assert that sovereignty that's inherent in their rights. One of the things that people often misunderstand about tribes is that they're given stuff. Tribes were not given anything. Tribes retained those reservations based on land treaties. Tribes fought to expand those by putting them through the processes that the United States has implemented, and tribes continue to defend those rights. But tribes also have inherent rights, rights that cannot be taken away from them, or that at least not until an act of Congress with their so-called plenary power, and that tribes will continue to exercise. In fact, it's been established what these certain rights are, among them being the ability to tax, being to establish police forces, to maintain sovereign immunity, so that way they can't be sued in court, the tribe as an entity can't be sued, and the power to form their own governments to a way that they find appropriate, and also the ability to structure their enrollment requirements for citizenship. So these things are inherent to a tribe that the U.S. has recognized as being inherent to them, and that they haven't moved to take away. Um, and that tribes continue to exercise, and that they should continue to exercise, because as a sovereign, that's what they're allowed to do, just as any other country says they're allowed to do.
And that raises an interesting question. Obviously, a lot of the abrogation of the sovereign, basically, that they were independent. In modern terms, they would be considered independent states. I mean, they were independent states. They were political entities with sovereignty, recognized sovereignty, and that sovereignty was later abrogated, and they weren't always fully annexed by the United States, but they were turned into subject or dependent nations. Now we live in another era where it's, with a few people on the alt-right notwithstanding, the ideas which justified the subjugation are no longer considered justifications to abrogate the sovereignty of any people, and these indigenous nations now retain, as you say, a large number of rights. Are there attempts to make them? Are there attempts to become independent countries? I mean, like with full sovereignty, is there kind of a push for even greater return of rights which had been abrogated in the 19th century?
Well, I mean, there's always talk about it within circles, um, and even natives who hold what would be considered radical views, according to the American political spectrum, virtually agree that our subjugation is going to continue, at least for now, and that it's important that we basically work with what we've got. There is always the push to assert our rights, excuse me, and to regain, quote unquote, rights that have been lost, according to the United States and what they've decided to abrogate or discontinue. And while I think it might be the ideal value that full independence is what would be established, most tribes, I would argue, are not in a position to actually do so, to accommodate a full sovereign status. And that's not due to incompetence or ignorance or something of that sort. But it's simply because they are still suffering the impacts of history, of what being a subjugated nation in a colonial system of oppression has done to them, and that they unfortunately might continue to be like that for a time. So, yes, tribes do want to assert that sovereignty where they can, but as of right now, it's been tribes I feel are happy to, maybe not happy is not the right word, but are certainly okay with trying to work within the American federal framework, mainly because we're learning about it and we've been able to use it to our advantage now.
Right. So for practical reasons, for pragmatic reasons, it's assert greater degrees of sovereignty, but still within the United States. It sounds a tad like a bit like the situation that I've heard for Puerto Rican politicians and political movements. The Puerto Rico's has at least, I think, three main political movements in the 20th century. There's those who want to continue things as is, which is a free associated state with certain rights, but also no real very strict limitations on its ability to change legislation, and no vote in Congress. Those who want statehood within the United States, and those who want independence. And it's my understanding that one of the major roadblocks that the independence movement has is that they aren't able to present a coherent plan where an independent Puerto Rico would be, in practice, economically beneficial, given the limitations on the island to become an independent republic. So that's what my understanding is. Would you say it's more or less a similar calculus in the case of indigenous peoples, or?
Yeah, I certainly would. And one thing that a lot of indigenous people like, one of the avenues they consider is like a coalition or a confederacy, a banding of multiple tribes together. Because as it stands right now, there are 567 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone. A lot of those are confederacies of themselves, of smaller tribes, and so they propose a banding together of these larger entities. For example, in Washington State, where I live, there are 29 federally recognized tribes and 4 state recognized tribes. And looking on a map, we control a large portion of the land and of the resources. And with our treaty rights extending even much further. Um, and also, tribes in itself, like altogether, are a very, very big economic powerhouse here in Washington State, where we're I believe last time I looked it up, we're the 5th largest employer in the United States, where we contribute millions annually to the revenue of the state, more than a drop in the bucket kind of deal. And
Right. Wait. Sorry to interrupt you there. You're the fifth largest employer in Washington State.
yes,
Oh wow.
yeah.
Wow. And you said that there's also a significant control of land and resources. How much? I mean, do you have any idea of the proportion of the land or?
You broke up right there, actually. What was that?
So, sorry. Do you have any idea of, in the case of land and resources, which you mentioned, do you have any idea of the proportion of the land or?
I don't have the statistics right here on hand, but the Yakima Reservation and the Colville Indian Reservation, both are which are actually confederacies, are located in eastern Washington. And I would say that if you put all of the reservations together, I mean, we're talking about 1/6, maybe 1/5 of the land mass of the state.
That's pretty big. And are we talking about a bunch of good agricultural land, for example, or are we talking more of mostly land that was raw deals kind of thing?
Well, so it's interesting with Washington State. Governor Isaac Stevens is the one who who organized the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 and the Treaty of 1855, the 2 treaties that really dealt with Washington State as a territory prior to exact statehood. And his idea, when it came to the tribes, is that he ultimately wanted to consolidate all of them onto one plot of area. And that is, I mean, it's unreasonable in my opinion, considering how much or how many natives there are actually in Washington State alone. But the land in itself, throughout the state, is generally good when it comes to game, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to water resources. The Yakima Indian Reservation, for example, it's right there in the basin over in eastern Washington. It's near Mount Adams, where a lot of streams flow from. It's near the Columbia River, one of the major water sources that goes throughout that area, which has a lot of arid land. And it's also very close by to Walla Walla, Washington, which has some of the best agricultural land in this region of the country, actually. So the land in itself it was quality land. Where these reservations were largely based on traditional grounds. And Isaac Stevens, although he certainly had what I would consider nefarious intentions in mind, did work with the tribes to a degree. And so I would say the tribes in this state had a slightly better deal. They weren't forced off and relocated to the degree that other tribes were, for sure.
Okay, so yeah, but so going back to your other point, but we're not talking about especially in some states like Washington, we're not talking about an insignificant part of the economy in some area with poor lands. In some areas, it's a very significant part of the economy of the state.
Oh, yes, very much. And that's from multiple sources, whether that be from natural resources such as the fishing industry, whether that be from the gaming industry, or whether that be from actually the medical industry too. Tribes, especially here on the I-5 corridor around Seattle and Tacoma, they're really expanding into areas such as cancer treatment, medical marijuana use, also recreational use, and so they're becoming quite the powerhouse in multiple sectors, even telecommunications. They have some of their own telecommunication organizations.
To basically for political purposes or economic purposes or interest group kind of like pressuring purposes in Congress, what would a kind of unification be or look like?
Well, we see some kinds of unifications already. For example, there's the National Congress of American Indians, which is united for tribes to be members of that organization for them to lobby their their collective interests. But essentially, those who would like to see more of a confederacy, more of a coalition type deal, would be for the political purposes that they entail. When it comes to dealing with the state, because tribes nowadays are dealing a lot more with the state in a way than they are with the feds handing a lot of the operations off to tribes, and then the tribes conduct those operations, and because they're doing so within state boundaries, they often have to work with the states in order for a good flow of the services to be carried out. So it would be more for political purposes that these coalitions would happen, and that's because the cultural differences are still there. Of course, for as many similarities as Indigenous peoples have, they can also be very vastly different from each other, and so interests don't always align.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, one of the major issues that Ernesto Che Guevara had when he tried to raise up an indigenous resistance movement in Bolivia was that he did not fully comprehend the centuries, if not the least centuries old animosities between several major indigenous groups, and just seemed to kind of lump them together and not understand that these are huge and historic divisions.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very much the case, and I believe that even happens with within the relationships between tribes and the United States government, federal or even state, where they try to treat tribes as if they were all a single entity, and that in itself is harmful to the relationship that they have with these tribes, because tribes not only do they have these cultural differences that have them at odds with other tribes at times, but even in the actual legal system itself, tribes are not designated as being the same. Um, some tribes have their reservations established by different treaties. Some tribes don't have their reservations established by treaties at all. Some were established by executive order. Some tribes have their hunting and fishing grounds designated as an area as an agreement with the state, as not opposed to the federal government. So, like, there's all these little nuances, even within the law itself, that would make it infeasible for the non-native governments and entities to treat the tribes as if they were one. Not only would they encounter conflict from the tribes themselves, but legally speaking, it's just not feasible to do.
Interesting. So this is an issue which is centuries in the making. It still obviously has a great deal of bearing on contemporary political and economic and social life in the United States, and um, it's likely going to continue to be to find its way into the headlines and international discussions in the future, especially with the projects like DAPL and others, which have been in the news, and it's a slow process from being recognized as independent and sovereign nations, reduced to subject nations, and now slowly climbing back and attempting to regain some of these lost rights. And it's really a story I hadn't been aware of, so I'm really grateful that you took the time to share it with us today.
Oh, yes, I'm very happy to always be here and to speak about these issues. Because as an Indigenous person myself, going through these systems, I've been in the public education system, and now I work in higher education, and I live in a state where politics are very much the thing that everybody's concerned about. These are very real items that touch my life and that touch the lives of millions of other natives too, and future natives to come. And so I think it's important to, when the opportunity arises, to get out there and speak about these issues, to elaborate on things, not only for the betterment of Indigenous peoples, but for the betterment of just everyday citizens and people in general around the world. Indigenous peoples are here too. As I said earlier, ultimately, we all come from Indigenous peoples, and I think there's value to the ways that things were done, and that we should always leave those kinds of options on the table when we're considering, how we're going about through life in general, and in this case, how we're going to recognize other people with their sovereign status and how their governments work with, so we can all cooperate more fully.
Perfect. So thanks again for coming on with us, and I wish you good luck in the future, and I'm sure you're going to come on once again because you're one of our favorite guests.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.